"It's a gift fit for a king, Silas, or at least for a king of the mud," Julian Blackwood sneered, his voice cutting through the humid afternoon like a rusted blade. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed a heavy, mud-caked and hideously torn leather saddle at the old man's feet. The impact sent a spray of dried filth onto Silas's worn trousers, but the blacksmith didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his hands, gnarled like oak roots, hanging heavy at his sides, while the laughter of Julian's sisters and their wealthy neighbors rang out from the porch of the great house. They thought they were watching a broken man being humiliated, but they had no idea that Julian had just handed over the one thing that would burn the Blackwood Empire to the ground. Inside that rotted leather lay a secret that had been buried for 5 years, a truth that the old colonel had taken to his grave, or so Julian believed. What began as a cruel joke on a sweltering summer day in the Mississippi Delta was about to become a reckoning. But before we reveal what Silas found hidden deep within those layers of moldy hide, I want to ask you to stay with me until the very end of this journey. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of a justice so profound it will leave you breathless. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel to support our storytelling, and as you listen, leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10 for this narrative. Your support is the fuel that keeps these forgotten voices alive. The air in the Delta during the summer of 1854 was thick enough to swallow a person whole. It carried the sweet, cloying scent of blooming jasmine. But if you breathed deep enough, you could taste the metallic tang of blood and the suffocating weight of a dying legacy. The Blackwood plantation had once been the pride of the county, but under Julian Blackwood's hand it was rotting. Julian was a man of refined silk waistcoats and expensive cigars, but his elegance was a thin veneer over a soul consumed by gambling debts and a desperate, clawing need for control. He ruled not through respect, but through the sheer terror he inflicted on those he claimed to own. At the center of this storm was Silas. He was an aging blacksmith who had seen 3 generations of Blackwoods come and go. His spirit had been shattered years ago, or so the masters thought, on the day his wife and daughter were sold downriver. Silas had been forced to shoe the very horses that carried them away, his hammer striking the iron in a rhythmic, soul-crushing beat while his heart bled out in the dirt of the forge. Since then, he had lived in a state of broken grace. He did his work with a mechanical, haunting precision that kept the overseer's lash away, but his eyes were like cold ash, reflecting nothing of the fire that used to burn within him. On this particular day, Julian had decided that Silas would be the centerpiece of his entertainment. He stood on the porch, surrounded by the elite of the county, men and women who sipped mint juleps while the sun beat down on the people working the fields. Julian pointed his cane at the ruined saddle lying in the dirt. It was a pathetic thing. The seat was ripped open, the stirrups were rusted orange, and the pommel was shattered as if it had been crushed by a falling tree. "Since you're such a loyal hound, Silas," Julian announced, his voice projecting to ensure every guest heard the insult, "you deserve a seat of honor. I command you to use this saddle every time you ride that pathetic work mule to the far fields. It's a mark of your status here." The laughter that followed was like the sound of cracked bells. Julian's sisters giggled behind their lace fans, and the neighbors nodded in approval of the wit of their host. To them, it was a public mark of ridicule, a way to signal that Silas was lower than the beast he rode. Silas didn't say a word. He slowly knelt, his joints popping with the effort, and picked up the stinking, heavy leather. He could feel the weight of it, a strange, uneven density that didn't match the appearance of the rotted hide. As he retreated to the shadows of the stables, he could still hear the echoes of their mockery. But Julian had a blind spot, a fatal one. He had been so focused on the humiliation that he had forgotten whose saddle that actually was. It had belonged to his father, the old colonel, a man who had died under mysterious circumstances 5 years prior. The old colonel had been a hard man, but in his final years he had changed. He had begun to loathe the very system that had built his fortune, spending hours locked in his library, writing in ledgers that Julian never bothered to open. While Julian was a degenerate, his father had been a man of deep, dangerous secrets, and now those secrets were resting in Silas's calloused hands. Late that night, the forge was a cavern of flickering orange light and dancing shadows. The rest of the plantation was silent, save for the chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful howl of a hound. Silas sat on a low wooden stool, the gift resting across his knees. He wasn't looking to repair it. He was looking for why the leather felt thick in places it should have been thin. His fingers traced the seams, feeling the deliberate hidden stitching beneath the surface. With a steady hand, he took a small paring knife and began to slice through the rotted lining. He expected perhaps a few hidden coins, or maybe a piece of jewelry the old colonel had hidden from his son's gambling hands. But as the leather parted, he didn't find gold. Instead, he pulled out thin sheets of vellum, wrapped tightly in oilskin to protect them from the dampness of the delta. Beneath the papers, his fingers brushed against something hard and cold, a heavy brass key. Silas's breath hitched in his chest. He unfolded the vellum, his eyes scanning the elegant, cramped handwriting of the man who had once been his master. It was what the old colonel had called the Freedom Ledger. It wasn't just a record of debts, it was a meticulously kept account of the plantation's true financial state, proving that the estate was technically insolvent. But more importantly, there were signed and notarized deeds of manumission for every single soul on the Blackwood estate. They were dated just 2 days before the colonel's accidental fall from his horse. Julian had suppressed the will, claiming everything for himself, but he hadn't known his father had sewn the backup proof into his favorite riding gear. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. He was holding the freedom of 100 people in his hands. Every time he had been mocked, every time he had been forced to bow, the key to their chains had been right there, waiting to be found. But there was a problem. A terrifying, immediate problem. Among the papers, Silas found a recent note, not from the colonel, but a scrap of paper he recognized as Julian's handwriting. It was a draft of a bill of sale. Julian, desperate for quick cash to pay off a creditor in New Orleans, had already signed the papers to sell a young boy named Elias to a notorious speculator. This speculator was known for one thing: working children to death in the brutal turpentine camps of Florida. Elias was only 10 years old. He was a quick-witted, bright-eyed child who worked as a water carrier, often bringing Silas a tin cup of cool water during the heat of the day. To Silas, Elias was the grandson he never had, the only spark of life that reminded him he was a human being, and not just a tool of the Blackwoods. The boy had no idea that in 3 days his life was scheduled to end in a swampy hell. Silas looked at the brass key, then at the documents, and then out into the darkness toward the slave quarters. He was in a harrowing position. If he took these papers to the local sheriff, he knew exactly what would happen. The sheriff drank Julian's whiskey and gambled at his table. He would likely hang Silas for theft and burn the papers before the ink could even be questioned. If Silas tried to run, he might save himself, but he would leave Elias and 100 others to the mercy of a man who had none. The conflict within Silas was a war between the survivor he had become, the man who stayed silent to stay alive, and the man he used to be. The symbol of the saddle had transformed in an instant. It was no longer a mark of shame or a cruel joke. It was a vessel of justice, a Trojan horse delivered by the dead to the most underestimated man on the plantation. "You think I'm broken, Julian," Silas whispered into the heat of the forge, his voice rasping from years of inhaling coal dust. "You think I'm just a beast to be ridden." He looked at the heavy brass key, knowing it likely fit the iron box buried beneath the floorboards of the old colonel's private library, a room Julian avoided because of the lingering guilt of how his father had died. Every time Silas rode that mule with the torn saddle from that moment on, he would be sitting on the freedom of his people. He would have to endure the laughter of the Blackwood family, the sneers of the overseers, and the pity of his own brothers and sisters, all while holding the fuse to an explosion that would change everything. But time was not on his side. The documents were a weapon, but a weapon is useless if you don't know when to strike. And then the first crack in the plan appeared. The following morning, a cloud of dust rose from the main road. It wasn't the speculator coming in 3 days. It was a carriage, and sitting inside was a man Silas recognized all too well, a man who worked for the very creditors Julian owed. The pressure on Julian was mounting, and when a man like Julian feels the walls closing in, he becomes more than just cruel. He becomes unpredictable, As Silas watched the carriage pull up to the great house, he saw Elias running across the yard with a bucket of water. The boy looked up and smiled at Silas, unaware that the shadow of the Florida camps was stretching out to grab him. Silas felt a cold shiver run down his spine despite the morning heat. He realized then that the 3 days he thought he had were a luxury he no longer possessed. But there was something else Silas noticed as the guest stepped out of the carriage. It wasn't just a creditor. It was someone who knew the old colonel personally, someone who had been present at the funeral with eyes full of suspicion. The game was changing, and Silas knew he had to move fast. But how does a man with no voice speak the truth to power? How does a slave use the master's own laws to break his chains? Silas gripped the handle of his hammer, his knuckles white. He knew the answer wouldn't be found in the forge. It would be found in the very house that had imprisoned him for decades. But to get there, he would have to play the part of the loyal hound one last time, even as the fire of rebellion began to roar in his chest. Silas pressed the oilskin packet against his chest, the edges of the vellum digging into his skin like a silent promise. The forge was cooling now, the embers glowing a deep, resentful red, but the heat inside Silas's heart was only beginning to roar. He knew he couldn't leave the documents here. The overseer, a man named Miller with eyes like a hungry hawk, often prowled the stables at night, looking for any reason to bring down his lash. Silas needed a place where no one would look, a place so humble and discarded that it was invisible to the masters. He moved through the shadows of the quarters, his footsteps silent on the packed earth. He reached his small, cramped shack, a place that smelled of old wood and the bitter scent of the lye soap he used to scrub the soot from his arms. Beneath a loose floorboard near the corner where he kept his meager straw mattress, Silas tucked the Freedom Ledger and the brass key. As he hammered the board back into place with the heel of his hand, he felt a strange sensation. It wasn't just fear, it was the weight of 100 lives, all resting on his ability to keep a secret in a house built on lies. But there was something Silas hadn't noticed yet. The danger was much closer than he thought. The next morning, the sun rose like a bruised plum over the delta, casting long, distorted shadows across the cotton fields. Julian Blackwood was already on the veranda, his voice raised in a sharp, agitated tone. He was talking to the guest who had arrived the evening before, a tall, austere man named Mr. Sterling. Sterling wasn't like the usual gamblers and drunkards Julian invited to the great house. He wore a suit of dark, heavy wool despite the heat, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who dealt in facts, not fantasies. "I told you, Sterling, the accounts will be settled by the end of the week," Julian snapped, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for a crystal decanter of bourbon. "The sale of the surplus labor is already being processed." "Surplus labor, Julian." Sterling's voice was cool, a stark contrast to Julian's frantic energy. "You're talking about children, and the old colonel's will was quite specific about the liquidation of assets. I was his legal counsel for 20 years, and I find it hard to believe he would have left the estate in such a shambles without a safety net for those he cared for." Silas, standing near the hitching post with the mule and the torn saddle, felt a jolt of electricity go through him. Sterling was the man. He was the one the colonel had trusted, but Julian was already moving to shut him down. "My father was a senile old man in his final days," Julian spat. "His safety nets were the delusions of a mind gone soft. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a plantation to run." As Julian turned away, Silas saw Elias scurrying toward the kitchen with a tray of empty glasses. The boy's eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond his years. When Julian passed him, he didn't even look at the child, but the boy flinched as if he had been struck. Silas caught Elias's gaze for a fleeting second, and in that moment, he knew he had to act. Later that afternoon, Silas found Elias hiding in the shadow of the smokehouse. The boy was shaking, his small hands clutching the hem of his oversized shirt. "Silas," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "I saw the paper on the master's desk. I saw my name. And I saw the man with the black hat coming from the gate. He's the one who takes the children to the swamps. He's here, Silas. He's here early." Silas felt a cold hand wrap around his heart. "Listen to me, Elias. You stay close to Aunt Hattie in the kitchen. Don't you wander off toward the road, you hear me? I've found something your Master Julian doesn't know about." Elias looked up, a flicker of hope struggling against the darkness in his eyes. "The Colonel, he used to tell me things, Silas. Before he fell, he told me that one day the leather would speak. I didn't know what he meant." Silas froze. The leather would speak. The old colonel had been preparing for this, even talking to a 10-year-old child, because he knew no one would suspect the boy of understanding. It was an estranjeza, a strange detail that confirmed everything Silas had found in the saddle. The colonel hadn't just hidden the papers. He had left a trail of breadcrumbs in the hearts of the people Julian despised. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things. Silas knew he needed more than just his word. He needed to know exactly what happened the night the colonel died. And there was only one person left who had been in the great house that night: Aunt Hattie. Aunt Hattie was the memory of Blackwood. She had birthed the children, buried the dead, and cooked the meals that fueled the empire. She was a woman of monumental silence, her face a map of 90 years of survival. When Silas entered the kitchen, the scent of slow-roasting pork and bitter greens filled the air. Hattie didn't look up from the dough she was kneading, but she knew it was him. "You've been digging in the dirt, Silas," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I can smell the old secrets on you." "Hattie, I found the saddle," Silas said, stepping closer until he was in the circle of the hearth's warmth. "I found what the colonel sewed inside, but I need to know. The night he fell, was it an accident?" Hattie stopped kneading. She looked at the window, toward the spot on the trail where the colonel's horse had been found. "The horse didn't throw him, Silas. The horse loved that man. I saw Julian coming back from the stables that night with a length of wire in his pocket. He didn't see me, he was smiling. The colonel was going to sign the papers the next morning. Julian couldn't let his inheritance walk away on 2 legs. The room seemed to grow colder. It wasn't just theft, it was murder. Julian had killed his own father to keep the people of Blackwood in chains, and now he was selling Elias to cover the tracks of his own greed. "But that was only the beginning of the long night," Hattie continued, her eyes turning back to Silas. "There's a box, Silas. A box in the library with a lock that matches the key you're holding, but Julian keeps that room locked tight. He's afraid of the ghosts in there." Silas felt the weight of the brass key in his pocket. He realized then that the secret wasn't just in the leather, but in the very memory of the walls. Julian was haunted, and that haunting was the only weakness Silas could exploit. But as he turned to leave the kitchen, a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Miller, the overseer. He was leaning against the frame, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "You're spending a lot of time away from the forge, blacksmith," Miller said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "And that mule of yours is still waiting for that royal saddle. Master Julian wants to see you ride it out to the north field. He wants a good laugh before the sun goes down." Silas nodded, his face a mask of submission. "I was just getting a drink of water, sir. I'm going now." "See that you do," Miller said, his eyes narrowing, "and tell that boy Elias to stop lurking in the corners. The speculator is in the parlor right now, and he doesn't like his property to be dusty." The speculator was already there. The clock was ticking faster than Silas could breathe. He walked back to the stables, picked up the torn, mud-caked saddle, and threw it onto the back of the old mule. As he cinched the straps, he felt the documents beneath his shirt. He was literally sitting on the freedom of every soul on this plantation, enduring the mockery of the men on the porch as he rode past. "Look at him!" Julian shouted from the veranda, raising his glass to the speculator, a man with a cruel, pockmarked face and a black hat. "The King of Blackwood on his throne of rot." The elite laughed, their voices echoing off the white columns of the house. Silas kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the mule's ears. He had to get to that library. He had to find the final piece of the puzzle. But how could he enter the great house, a place he was forbidden to step into, without being caught and killed on the spot? He realized he needed a distraction, something so big that even Julian and Miller would be forced to look away. And he knew exactly where to find it. But it was a gamble that could cost him everything. If he failed, Elias would be gone by morning, and the Freedom Ledger would be nothing more than fuel for Julian's fireplace. And that's when everything took a turn for the worse. As Silas reached the edge of the north field, he saw a group of men on horseback approaching the plantation gates. They weren't neighbors. They were wearing the badges of the county marshals. Julian's debts had finally caught up to him in a way he couldn't laugh off. The marshals were there to seize property, and in 1854, property meant people. Silas watched as Julian's face turned from a smug mask of arrogance to a pale sheet of terror. The chaos was starting. This was the moment. But as Silas turned the mule back toward the house, he saw Miller grabbing Elias by the arm, dragging the screaming boy toward the speculator's wagon. "No," Silas whispered, his grip tightening on the reins. He had to choose. The documents in the library or the boy in the wagon. The survivor in him screamed to stay hidden, to wait for a better moment. But the man he used to be, the man who had lost his own daughter, knew that there would never be another moment. The fuse was lit. The explosion was coming, and Silas was the only one who could decide who would survive the blast. The world seemed to slow down as Silas watched Miller's hand tighten around Elias's shoulder. The boy's cries were thin and sharp, piercing through the heavy Delta air, but the men on the porch were too busy arguing with the marshals to care. Julian was shouting, his face a shade of purple that looked like rotting fruit, waving a stack of papers at the men in the badges. The chaos was a storm, and Silas knew that if he didn't move now, the storm would swallow Elias whole. Silas looked at the torn saddle resting on the mule's back. He looked at the great house, its white columns standing like the ribs of a bleached carcass. He had a choice. He could take the papers he already had and run, or he could go into the lion's den to find the final proof that would not just save Elias, but destroy Julian Blackwood forever. "I'm coming, son," Silas whispered, though the wind carried his words away. But he couldn't just walk into the house. He needed a distraction, something so loud and so terrifying that every eye on the plantation would turn away from the library. He turned his gaze toward the forge. In his years as a blacksmith, he had learned that fire was a fickle friend, but smoke was a master of deception. Silas moved with a sudden renewed energy. He hurried to the forge, where the coals were still breathing. He grabbed a heavy bucket of water and a pile of damp green hay he had hidden behind the bellows. With a grunt of effort, he threw the hay onto the coals and followed it with a measured splash of water. A thick, rotted-smelling plume of white and grey smoke billowed upward, catching the breeze and rolling directly toward the great house. "Fire! The forge is blowing!" someone screamed from the quarters. The reaction was instantaneous. Miller, always a man who feared losing the master's tools more than the master's people, let go of Elias's arm for a split second to look at the rising cloud. "Run, Elias, to the corn!" Silas bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip. The boy didn't hesitate. He dived under the speculator's wagon and disappeared into the tall, swaying stalks of the cornfield. Miller cursed and reached for his pistol, but the marshals were already shouting, thinking the plantation was being sabotaged. In the confusion of shouting men and panicked horses, Silas slipped toward the back entrance of the great house. He had spent decades on this land, but he had never stepped foot inside the main hallway. The air inside was different, cool, smelling of lemon oil and old paper, and a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. He moved like a ghost, his bare feet silent on the expensive rugs. He knew where the library was. He had watched the old colonel through the window for years. He reached the heavy mahogany doors. They were locked, just as Aunt Hattie had said. Julian kept the key on his belt, but Silas didn't need Julian's key. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key he had found in the saddle. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thud. What if it didn't fit? What if the old colonel had been playing a game even in death? He slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, oily click that sounded like music to his ears. The library was a tomb of shadows. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of books that Julian had never touched. In the center of the room stood the colonel's desk, covered in a layer of fine grey dust. Silas didn't look at the books. He went straight to the floorboards near the window, just as Hattie had described. He knelt, his fingers searching for the slight gap in the wood. He found it. A loose board, perfectly fitted. He pried it up, and there, nestled in the dirt beneath the house, was a heavy iron box. But as his fingers brushed the cold metal, a voice sliced through the silence of the room. I knew you were a thief, Silas. I just didn't know you were a brave one. Silas froze. He slowly turned his head. Standing in the doorway was Julian Blackwood. He wasn't shouting anymore. He looked tired, his silk waistcoat stained with sweat, but he was holding a small silver-plated derringer pointed straight at Silas's chest. "You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" Julian sneered, stepping into the room. "The marshals are outside seizing my cattle and my cotton, but they won't seize my secrets. Give me that box." Silas didn't move. He felt the weight of the key in his hand and the weight of the documents beneath his shirt. "This isn't yours, Julian," Silas said, his voice surprisingly steady. "The Colonel didn't leave this for you. He left it for us." Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "My father was a fool who lost his nerve at the end. He thought he could undo a century of tradition with a few pieces of paper. But those papers don't exist if I burn them. And you don't exist if I pull this trigger." This was the moment of no return. Silas could see the finger tightening on the trigger. He knew that Julian was desperate enough to kill him and hide the body in the confusion of the marshal's arrival. But Silas also knew something Julian didn't. "You killed him, didn't you?" Silas asked, his voice low and cold. "The horse didn't throw him? You used the wire? Hattie saw you?" The color drained from Julian's face. The gun wavered for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Silas needed. But Silas didn't attack. Instead, he did something that confused Julian even more. He sat back on his heels and placed the iron box on the desk. "Go ahead," Silas said. "Shoot me. But Mr. Sterling is standing right outside that door with the circuit judge. I saw their carriage pull up behind the marshals. Do you think they'll believe a thieving slave killed the master's son? Or will they wonder why the master's son is in a locked room with a box he claims doesn't exist?" Julian's eyes darted toward the window. He was trapped. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of cruelty and debt, and now the tide was coming in. "You're lying," Julian whispered, but the bravado was gone. "Am I?" Silas asked. "The judge owed your father his life. He's been waiting for a reason to look into that accident, and I'm the one holding the reason." But there was a problem. Silas could hear Miller's voice outside getting closer. The overseer had realized the fire was a fake, and he was coming for blood. The distraction was over, and the real battle was about to begin. Silas gripped the iron box, his mind racing. He had the evidence, but he was still a man in a room with a gun pointed at him, while a murderer and a hunter closed in from all sides. He had to get that box to the judge, but the hallway was a gauntlet of enemies. "Give me the box, Silas," Julian said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "Give it to me and I'll let you and the boy go. I'll sign the papers myself. Just give me the proof of what I did." It was a tempting offer, a way out, a way to save Elias without a fight. But Silas looked at Julian's eyes and saw the same lie that had kept his people in chains for generations. Julian would never let them go. He would wait until the box was in his hands, and then he would finish what he started. "No," Silas said, his voice ringing out in the quiet library. "The time for deals is over. The truth is out of the saddle now, Julian, and it's too big for you to hide." Just as the words left his lips, the library door burst open. But it wasn't the judge. It was Miller, his face covered in soot, his eyes burning with a murderous light. He didn't look at Julian. He looked straight at Silas, and in his hand was the heavy leather strap he used to break the spirits of the men in the fields. "I found the boy, Master Julian," Miller growled. "He's in the wagon. Now what do you want me to do with this piece of filth?" Silas felt a cold dread wash over him. Elias was caught. The leverage was gone. Or was it? Silas looked at the iron box one last time, and then he looked at the window. He realized that to save the future he had to destroy the past, and he was the only one with the strength to do it. Miller's presence in the room was like a suffocating heat, smelling of sweat and the bitter oil he used on his boots. He stood there, blocking the only exit, his eyes fixed on Silas with a hunger that was purely predatory. Behind him, through the open door, Silas could hear the distant, muffled sobbing of Elias. The boy was back in the wagon, back in the hands of the speculator, and Silas felt a piece of his soul wither at the sound. "The boy is secured, Master Julian," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. "Now give me the word, and I'll take this old dog back to the forge and teach him why we don't touch things that belong to our betters." Julian's hand was still shaking. The derringer pointed at Silas's chest. He looked at the iron box on the desk, then at Miller and then back at Silas. The desperation in his eyes was replaced by a flickering hope, the hope of a man who thinks he can still bury his crimes. "The box, Silas," Julian whispered, his voice gaining a jagged edge of authority. "Give it to Miller now, or the boy leaves for Florida within the hour, and you won't live to see the sunset." Silas looked down at the iron box. He knew that inside were the records of Julian's embezzlement, the proof that the Blackwood fortune was built on stolen credit and unpaid blood. But he also knew that the documents tucked beneath his own shirt, the manumission papers, were the real heart of the Colonel's legacy. If he gave Julian the box, Julian would burn it, thinking he was safe. "You think this box is your only problem, Julian?" Silas asked, his voice echoing in the quiet library. "You think if you destroy this metal, the truth dies with it?" "I said give it to him," Julian screamed, his composure finally snapping. Silas slowly pushed the iron box across the mahogany surface of the desk. Miller stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with triumph as he reached for the prize. But Silas didn't let go of the box. He kept his hand firmly on the lid, his gaze locked on Julian. "This box holds your debts, Julian. It holds the names of the men you cheated. But the saddle held your father's heart." Before Julian could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. These weren't the boots of overseers or slaves. They were the polished, deliberate steps of men who carried the weight of the law. "What is the meaning of this?" a voice boomed from the doorway. Mr. Sterling stepped into the room, followed by a man whose presence made Julian's knees buckle. It was Judge Henderson, an aging man with a mane of white hair and eyes that had seen the rise and fall of dozens of families in the Delta. He was the one guest Julian had been unable to buy, and the one man the old colonel had called a true friend. "Judge Sterling," Julian stammered, trying to hide the derringer behind his back. "This is a private matter. This slave has broken into my library and attempted to steal family property." Miller immediately backed away from the desk, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt, but the two armed marshals standing behind the judge made him think twice. "Family property, Julian?" Judge Henderson asked, his voice cold and resonant. "I was informed by Mr. Sterling that there were discrepancies regarding your father's final wishes, and I see you are holding a weapon. Are you in the habit of using lethal force against your blacksmith in your own library?" "He's a thief," Julian shouted, his voice high and thin. "He's been digging through my father's things." Silas didn't cower. He stood tall, the mud from the north field still staining his trousers, the torn saddle, now just a memory, having served its purpose. He slowly reached into his shirt and pulled out the oilskin packet. "I am no thief, Your Honor," Silas said, his voice calm and clear for the first time in 20 years. "I am a messenger. The colonel left these papers inside his riding saddle. He knew his son would never look there, because his son never respected the work that built this house." Silas walked forward and placed the oilskin documents on the desk next to the iron box. "These are the deeds of manumission, signed and notarized by the colonel 2 days before he died, and inside that box you'll find the records of how Julian Blackwood has been defrauding the very men who are standing at his gates today." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked at the papers as if they were poisonous snakes. He knew he was finished. The torn saddle had been a Trojan horse, a final move from a father who knew his son's character better than the son knew himself. But Julian wasn't the only one in danger. Miller, seeing the walls closing in, made a desperate move. He lunged toward Silas, his hand going for the blacksmith's throat. "You're lying, you piece of filth," Miller roared. But Silas was a man who had spent his life swinging a heavy hammer against glowing iron. He didn't flinch. He caught Miller's wrist in a grip that was as unyielding as a vice. "The fire is out, Miller," Silas said, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. "And you're the one who's going to burn." The marshals moved in, pinning Miller against the wall and disarming Julian. The judge picked up the vellum sheets, his eyes scanning the colonel's handwriting with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. "Julian Blackwood," the judge said, looking up from the papers. These documents are authentic. Every soul on this plantation was freed 5 years ago. You have been holding these people in illegal servitude, and you have been embezzling from the estate's creditors to fund your own decay." Julian collapsed into a leather chair, his face buried in his hands. He was no longer the master of Blackwood. He was a man who had lost everything to a torn piece of leather he had used to mock a man he thought was beneath him. But Silas wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking out the window, toward the wagon where Elias was still waiting. "The boy, Your Honor," Silas said, his voice trembling slightly. "Please, save the boy." But as the marshals led Julian and Miller away in irons, a new shadow appeared at the gate. It was the speculator, and he wasn't happy about losing his property. He was reaching for his rifle, and for a moment it seemed that the justice Silas had fought for would be written in more blood. But Silas knew that the truth, once it finds its way to the light, cannot be put back into the dark, and he was ready to do whatever it took to make sure Elias never saw those turpentine camps. The speculator's rifle never fired. Before he could even level the barrel, Judge Henderson stepped onto the veranda, his voice booming with the authority of a man who held the scales of life and death. He declared the sale of Elias illegal, and the boy a free citizen of the state, protected by the colonel's true will. Seeing the marshal's weapons drawn and the law finally standing tall, the speculator retreated into the dust, his wagon empty. Julian Blackwood was led away in irons, stumbling past the very people he had tormented, ruined not by a violent revolt, but by the crushing weight of the justice he had tried to bury. The restoration of Blackwood began that very afternoon. Under the judge's supervision, the manumission papers were executed on the spot. 100 souls walked out of the quarters, no longer property, but people with names that finally belonged to them. Silas didn't stay to watch the house crumble. He took Elias's hand and walked toward the river, leaving the rot of the plantation behind. The final image of their journey is one of quiet strength. Silas and Elias stood on the deck of a northbound steamer, the cool spray of the Mississippi hitting their faces. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out the last scraps of the torn saddle, now just useless, weathered leather. He watched as they fell into the churning brown water, sinking into the depths. He didn't need the secrets anymore. "Freedom isn't just a piece of paper, Elias," Silas whispered as the sun dipped below the horizon. "It's the fire that survives the dark." The boy looked up and smiled, his eyes finally reflecting the light of a new dawn. The path to justice had been hidden in the very thing the powerful use to humiliate the weak, proving that those who build their empire on cruelty will find that even the smallest object they despise can become the stone that shatters their foundation. If this story of courage and hidden justice moved you, please subscribe to the channel to join our community and support our work. We bring you powerful narratives like this every week, and we would love to have you with us. Before you go, please leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10 for Silas's journey. Your feedback is truly important to us, and we read every single word. Thank you for watching until the very end.